Welcome to our TASA Thursday webinar, Fickle Futures, the New Homelessness. My name is John McGuire, and with Nita Alexander, I am the co-convener of the Sociology and Activism Thematic group. Before we begin, I'd also like to acknowledge that many of us, maybe all of us, are meeting on many lands of the traditional owners of this country. I'm joining this meeting on the country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and acknowledge their ancestors have been traditional owners of this country for thousands of years. I also wish to acknowledge and pay respects to the Gadigal people's elders, past, present, and emerging. I also invite you to please feel free to acknowledge the people whose lands you are on in the chat or in your interactions as part of this webinar. This webinar has been quite a long time in planning. We've been meeting throughout the year to discuss homelessness as an issue, discussing homelessness from a sociological perspective, but also with our activist thematic lens, thinking not only about understanding homelessness, but thinking about action, both on the macro level of social-wide change, but also the lived experience and the actions that can be taken in the here and now. Today we have two substantive speakers. Dr. Lawless will speak to us about navigating the lived experience of homelessness, and Dr. Zoei Sutton will speak on homelessness in relation to non-humans. We also have Nita Alexander, who will speak to us about the next steps in our Fickle Futures project and what we have planned in the immediate future around the project. After our three speakers, time allowing, we'll be able to open up the floor to comments and questions before we finish up at 1:30 East Coast Daylight Savings time. Could I ask that you keep your mic on mute while our speakers are speaking? And if we're ready, I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker. Dr. Lawless is a sociologist and is active in TASA as a convener of our Social Stratification Thematic group and co-convener of our Health Sociology Thematic group. Welcome, Anne. The floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon. It's still good morning in West Australia. I know we have at least one guest here from Japan today. So hello, Momo. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to our Australians for coming. She just gave us a beautiful smile and wave. I'm now going to attempt to share my screen and put up a PowerPoint. Okay, so I'm talking today about how I have navigated homelessness this year. And also today, as John said, we're launching the Fickle Futures project. And it won't navigate down. It's just being naughty. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Australian country in which I am today and its Indigenous people. Always has been their land, always will be. My acknowledgement today is a little different. I've been on the move this year from Wajak Noongar land, which is Fremantle in Western Australia, to Gowna land, to Adelaide in South Australia, and now Lutruwita, which is Launceston in Tasmania, and soon I'm moving to Ngunnawal country, to Canberra in the Australian Capital Territory. This used to be my front view, looking out over Memorial Park in Fremantle, and I lived there from 2018 to 2022. I was there for just over 4 years, and one of the beauties of Fremantle is the stunning sunsets that you can have in Fremantle and Perth, and also the view that I had of that, which was a source of great pleasure and enjoyment to me. The journey I'm going to share with you today has got several navigation points, and if we were playing bingo, we could say, can you talk to count the number of navigation points that I'm going to cover with you today. So what happened in Fremantle, I'd been there for 4 years when I received an eviction notice by email. It was the first, I'd had no previous warning that was coming, and the eviction was due to the sale of the property, the pending sale of the property to an investor who was, as part of the sale, required vacant possession. And as some of you know, in Australia, this has been a very common practice that to evict tenants so that the investor can claim certain benefits and rights as part of that sale, which are supported by the Australian government. It was made, I'd been in, I think some of you know this, but I'd been in isolation in during the COVID period for 2.5 years at that point. And I was very, very COVID aware and very aware of masking and of living a fairly isolated life in some ways, in terms of the real world, but not in social media. And but they made it compulsory for an electrician to come in, and also for a financial evaluator to come in. So when I asked them to wear masks as part of that process, the response by the financial evaluator was there was no need for him to wear a mask because he'd already had COVID and he couldn't give it to me. And also the other thing was that the electrician said, oh, look, I'll wear a mask, but it's just for your comfort. I actually think it's for my protection. The sale was, not the sale, but the inspection by both those people was delayed because the electrician got COVID and had to reschedule several times. So part of the story of navigating this landscape is also about trying to navigate our pandemic and trying to keep myself and others safe. I did then receive a very threatening letter from my landlord, and he said through the agent, and said that if I obstructed the sale, that he would take action against me. And there are a number of other very aggressive and brutal features of the eviction story, which I won't go into now, but it was a particularly harrowing and brutal eviction process. I went to see my GP. Oh, I went ahead of myself. I went to see my GP, and he advised me, he's just down the hill on the other side of that, those trees. And the GP advised that he gave me the information I needed to get into a women's shelter. He agreed with me that hundreds of his patients and patients in the practice was experiencing the same situation, and they were giving out information about how to get women into a women's shelter or into a pre-homelessness program for women that the Fremantle Area Council had set up. But the condition of that was no pets. And I have a pet who I'll introduce you to later, my best bud and my companion and a member of my family. So that was a bit of a blow, is what do I do and how do I keep my family together? At the very same time, we had a major family crisis going on in Adelaide, in South Australia, and it's okay for me to talk about it, but my older brother, my best bro, developed esophageal cancer, and the prospects were not good. There was a very real prospect that he wouldn't survive the surgery in Adelaide, and that I'd be going over, if I did go over, for a funeral. You can imagine how harrowing that can be for people. And the other thing I've heard from other homeless people is other crises come at you at almost the same time. You've probably heard that phrase, they come in threes. So I took off to Adelaide, and I took up a cousin's offer to borrow a caravan, and he set it up for me at Adelaide Caravan Park. Now, he's decided to be shy, and he's hiding there in the flap of the tent. But this is my companion, and his name is Lawless, and Bernie is 18 years old. We have been together for 17 years. And moving to Adelaide was a big thing. It took a bit of effort to get there. One has to declutter and get removalists and go down to op shops and make lots of donations. But we got to Adelaide, and of course the first thing to do was let's go for a walk. Let's try to assess, where have I landed on this navigation point? This is a photo I took of the front shortly after we got there. At the front there, you can see an aircraft carrier, because I did decide to fly, as terrified as I am of catching COVID. But you can see the carrier there in the front, and that's Bernie, the tent, and the caravan all set up, which my cousin did beautifully and was part of a very warm welcome to Adelaide. In the resources in the camp are a shower block for women, a shower and toilet block for women, and another one for men, a camp kitchen, a laundrette, and some other resources which I'm about to show you. One of the things I found in this amazing navigation of this homeless landscape is the resources that are available in caravan parks as one option for homeless people. I was able to afford to rent a site. At that time, it was $45 a night, and it's now currently doubling. It's going to, that same site would now cost me double that because it's now tourism and holiday season. But that makes a substantial impact on a person's budget. So this option is only available to people that can afford those sort of fees. But here we've got the emergence of community. And you can see here's a beautiful big book on embroidery, some DVDs, some magazines. There's one there called Australian Options, which is produced in Adelaide, and some books. They were all available for people to borrow, and quite often I would see them disappear for a few days and then come back, and sometimes with new things on offer too. So Community Corner grew and developed in the period that I was there. And I didn't do this. This is someone else's bright idea, was clean, freshly laundered clothing. And I very happily took a pair of socks and a warm t-shirt because I was there in Adelaide in winter. The caravan leaked heavily in rain and it was really cold. Another great resource in caravan parks, I hope this can give you a smile and a giggle, is that they've got defibrillators available if you have a nasty health problem. In about July, I decided I had witnessed an incident in the manager's office while I was waiting to have my period extended. And it was very much on his grace because they have the right to refuse you long-term accommodation. I witnessed an incident which led me to start a conversation on Twitter, and that has, along with wonderful colleagues who is here today, is one of the projects that has evolved out of that, but also a remarkable, very welcome offer to look into the future and to come to Tasmania eventually. However, while I was in Adelaide, here's another navigation point. While I was in Adelaide, I was offered a week's free board in exchange for becoming a respite carer. And just as I found in caravan parks when you get dog cuddles, was the opportunity to cuddle and walk dogs. And this is the dog in the household that I care for. I won't show you the hits because I haven't asked their permission, but I did ask for their permission to show you the dog. And this dog is so among the experience of going back to the caravan park was the experience that that community was growing and developing there. It's a shifting population, but it does have a fairly persistent culture. And for sociologists, of course, that's fascinating. How do you have a persistent culture in the midst of a shifting individual population? So lots of dogs in the park, but also some cats and one bird. A shifting population of a remarkable cosmopolitan and mixed community. There were people there who were on holidays, but there were people like myself who had a tent only, some who had a car only, some who had a ute only, vans, and also people who were homeschooling and in the caravan park, obviously the children doing their lessons, and also who were attending jobs. They were living and working in Adelaide and living in the caravan park. As an example, though, of the extremes that I saw was I was walking past a trailer which had a little bit of tarpaulin on it, and I saw 8 legs sticking out. 4 of those legs obviously belonged to children, and the rest of the legs belonged to adults. This was a family that was sleeping under a tarpaulin in the back of a trailer in the caravan park. The advantage being, of course, is access to those resources. And also the safety that is available in some caravan parks, although I was warned, and I was very glad to get the warning, that not all caravan parks are safe for women and children. So having had the experience now of being in a caravan and park and also being a respite carer, from the respite carer experience, I did learn that I'm not strong enough to do heavy lifting for a disabled adult. Yes, I can do light duties and household duties, but lifting and caring for a person with disabilities was a bit much for me. So as a navigation point, I've come to understand there are some things I can do and some things I can't. So I've had a remarkable opportunity, and as a result of that Twitter thread, a very generous person who has never met me has offered me the opportunity to live in Tasmania, where I am today. And among the other things I have found on this remarkable journey is what I call collateral beauty. It's the beauty that comes to you amidst terrible adversity. And as you can see, I think they should appoint me ambassador for the city, because Launceston is full of magical places. It's got a black cat who features in various spots around the city. It's got some beautiful street art, which you can see there. It's got street libraries, and probably most of you are aware of these, but street libraries, there are a couple within very close to where I am, and there is some fantastic quality literature available in our street libraries. But there's also the beauty of nature, and another feature of the city is these tiny doors that you can see here. They're hidden in a few places around, and I'm still looking for more. So part of the collateral beauty is also, of course, the street art that I've shown you, but also to experience the non-human world and to renew and deepen my understanding. And I can now introduce you to my friend. The little orange-cheeked cockatiel is Bernie, and he's 18 years old. Of course, things have a health impact. And at 3 p.m, the flag is flying. I'm looking at the post office tower, the wind, there's beautiful low clouds. And I think, yes, I can do this. I can navigate this landscape. But the truth telling requires also that at 3 a.m, in the darkness, the monsters come out. And of course, there is a very negative and terrifying moments in this journey. And that's another navigation point is, I suppose, the psychological one is navigating the darkness at 3 o'clock in the morning. And of course, stress does have severe effects on homeless people. It's had that effect on me. If I was to list them all, and I did a couple of days ago, I looked at it, and it's a map of stress and of exacerbation of current health problems. It is a very tough experience to get through. What I found was, though, that everything that I had learnt in the past I could now call upon and draw from. And that was the value of caring for ourselves, to eat well, to get rest and sleep when I could, to get exercise, to value friends, to develop new friends, to value my Twitter pals, but also to lead that creative life. And as you can see, I've taken up photography. I continued both in the caravan park and here in Tasmania. I've continued to do my voluntary work, and it's led to us all being here together today. And it will lead me to Canberra because I've been offered a house sit in Canberra as a result of voluntary work I do with people at the Australian National University. I have kept close to me the people I love, and that has included the non-human world. So I'm moving towards the end of my presentation. I want to lead us towards handing over to Zoei, who will talk about what Zoe's going to talk about. Later in the conversation, we're going to have a look at what can we do about the housing crisis. And we've got a definition there of homelessness. It does include people who are rough sleeping, but it includes people living in insecure temporary accommodation, such as boarding houses, caravan parks, hostels, a refuge, a shelter, short-term or long-term, where we have no secure lease and that we're not really living there by choice. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing. I am screen sharing. Let's stop the share. Thank you for listening to my navigation points, and I'll now hand back to John.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for sharing, your lived experience. We know that that's not always an easy thing to do, and we really appreciate what you're doing there. What I'd like to do now is introduce our next speaker. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Zoei Sutton. So Zoei is a lecturer in sociology at Flinders University and is the co-convener of the TASA Sociology and Animals thematic group. Welcome, Zoei, and thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you for having me. And thank you so much, Anne, for sharing your story. I really appreciate you sharing that. I've angered the computer, so give me a minute to pull up the right presentation, hopefully. Have you got me back again?
You're back, Zoei. All good.
All right. Sorry, the computer rejected me. Yeah, so what I wanted to talk to you today following Anne's shared experience, which was really powerful to hear about, was I recently finished a research project on housing insecurity for multi-species families. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what this insecurity looked like. Yes, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about housing insecurity. I finished a research project recently that was based in South Australia, and the people that I spoke to were currently in housing, but they spoke about these narratives of navigating insecure housing and the barriers to accessing housing and the impacts that this had on them. So I thought this might be a good topic to give you a little bit of insight into what it's actually like to try to break into the housing accommodation in South Australia, and what this then means for people that are working in the South Australian context. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of the project and then the South Australian context, and then move into the experiences of the participants that I spoke to. The project itself was looking at how people actually navigate housing situations. So I'm based in South Australia, and we currently don't have any of that tenant supportive legislation that means that it's kind of up to the tenants to be able to request and be approved to have an animal in their houses. At the moment, home ownership, including tenants with pets, is still at the landlord's discretion. So considering I was in this context where we didn't have any legislation to support tenants who were living with pets, there was nothing that would stop landlords from rejecting people's applications with pets on them. I wanted to know how people were actually getting housing. So I spoke to people who are currently living with pets in rental accommodation and housing stakeholders who are working in homelessness support and tenancy advocacy, property management, and landlords as well, just to talk about how we actually navigate this interaction between trying to breach this insecure housing situation and how people actually end up in housing and hopefully stay in housing. The aim was to come away with some tips for people who are trying to navigate this really difficult situation to help them get into housing and stay in housing. But as we'll talk about in a little bit, it's very much just about the current housing crisis and really that structural context that means that you can make these really small individual changes and they might make a difference. But overall, we really need broader structural change, which is why I think the Fickle Futures project is really important. Apologies for the slides flicking forward and back. I don't know why the computer's angry today. I worked on this project not by myself, but with a partner organization called Safe Pets, Safe Families. And Safe Pets, Safe Families work in the domestic violence space. They work with homelessness, but really what they do is they're a fostering organization so that when people are trying to move into housing, they can foster animals for you. And they have a foster network and they're all volunteers, which really means that when you're trying to find somewhere that you can live safely with your multi-species family, the idea is that you can get your pet fostered by someone who will look after them. You can go and try to find housing. And when you get that housing, you can get them back again. They run a whole range of really great programs, particularly around vet pop-up clinics and different kinds of support for multi-species families. But in this project, they were really involved to facilitate recruitment for the participants and also to inform the dissemination, which is what we're working on now with the findings. It was also funded by the Society for Companion Animal Studies, who had their sticker on the front page, but I should highlight that as well. So in South Australia, we know that about 28% of households are renting. About 62% of households include companion animals, often more cats than other states. During the pandemic, our Australian figures of home ownership with pets kind of increased so that 69% of households in Australia included a companion animal, but I don't have a South Australian breakdown for you of that yet. And much like the rest of Australia, South Australia is in a housing crisis. And a recent report highlighted that in March 2022, the vacancy rate in South Australia catastrophically hit 0.2%. So there was just no houses around and competition for housing is really, really high. As I mentioned, our legislative context is that we don't have anything to support pet-friendly tenancies. So pet-friendly tenancies are at a landlord's discretion. We did have a bill proposed that was going to change that, but that bill's been voted against. So in South Australia, we still don't have any legislative protection for tenants who are living with pets. When I was doing my project, I only found one organisation in South Australia that was dedicated to helping pet-owning tenants, and that was the Partner organisation. So the project that I'm talking about did look at facilitators and barriers to housing. Usually I spend a bit of time on the facilitators, but because I'm talking to you about housing insecurity, I really wanted to give you a bit of time to talk about the barriers that people were talking about. So this is going to be a bit of a negative presentation, and I'm sorry. I can talk to you about facilitators later, but really we're talking about a structurally intense situation that a lot of people were impacted really negatively by. So when I was talking to people about their experiences of housing, the first thing that anyone talked about, and this was stakeholders or tenants, the first thing they mentioned was the housing system. The housing system is broken. There's not enough housing. There's not enough stock. And this competition meant that the threat of homelessness was really the backdrop to all of their interactions with the housing system. There were a few things that specifically made it difficult for them to get into housing. And we can get into specifics of this later if you want, but very quickly it was things like ambiguity around the application process, whether or not they could apply with particular animals, whether pet friendly meant that you could apply with any kind of animal you liked, whether it meant you could have one single goldfish, whether goldfish were okay, whether dogs were okay, no one really knew. And this was something that was seen across the board. So some landlords that I spoke to and some property management organizations would say, oh, well, everyone knows that if you don't put pet friendly on the ad, that means that, you know, it's definitely pet friendly. We don't put it on any ads. So if it says no pets, you can't apply with a pet. But if there's nothing on there, that means it's pet friendly. Whereas everyone else would say, if it doesn't say pet friendly, we assume it's not pet friendly. And if it does say pet friendly, we don't really know what that means. The biggest thing people came up against is landlord and property manager reluctance. And I'm going to talk a little bit about discrimination in a minute. But this was really that attitude around the additional risk that was perceived to accompany people with pets. So that people kind of knew that if they put in an application with pets on it, they were already working at a disadvantage. They knew that there were these ideas in the air. Almost every person I interviewed trotted out the same line, which is that, you know, pets cause less damage than kids, but we're not allowed to have pets in properties. And we all know that there is discrimination against pets in properties. And that's particularly what tenants said to me. So there was this great reluctance against accepting someone with pets. People were rejected again and again, and some tenants actually tested this by putting in an application with no pets on it and then to find that they had been accepted. But really this reluctance was the main key that kept them out of pet-friendly housing. Tenant factors that people cited were things like affordability and also particular stigmas around groups. So single parents, people who come from domestic violence backgrounds, people who had come out of homelessness. There were a whole range of factors that meant that people were seen to be less of a safe choice if you were looking to rent housing accommodation to people. And support services were also a real challenge for multi-species families. So support services were often shaped around this attitude that the need was to get the individual person that you're working with into housing. And if you came with companion animals and a house was available and it wasn't pet friendly, really what that meant was that you should probably consider giving that animal up. And some people had that directly said to them that, you know, do you want a house or do you want to keep your animal and be homeless? So you need to get rid of your animal. Which means that when you're trying to come through support services, when you're coming out of crisis accommodation, when you're coming through tenancy support and the people that are hoping to help you, that constant attitude that pet friendliness isn't important, that your animals don't count, they're not a part of your family, and that this just isn't something that can be accommodated by the housing system is something you come up against again and again. So on discrimination, all of the tenants talked about really knowing that there was a feeling that you were being discriminated against, but it was really hard to know why you're rejected for a house. You don't get a reason for being rejected for housing. You'll just get rejection after rejection after rejection. So one tenant said, you know, there's nothing to protect you if you do have pets. There's nothing. You know, people and property managers that are discriminating against you because you have pets, when you speak to them just by the tone of their voice, you know that there's no chance for you because you've got animals. And a lot of people said this. They would be talking to a property manager, it would all seem fine, and they would mention an animal and just see a face drop or a tone and voice change, and you would know there's no way that you're getting this house. You can never prove that. There's nothing you could fight against because no one would ever say it, but you just knew that, again, you weren't going to get any sort of housing. One participant who I spoke to who was homeless directly before they were in the housing that I spoke to them about had been living in a tent. And they mentioned that there was a real stigma about homelessness, so that they couldn't even get access to see what houses were available for rent. So when they went into rental agencies, they would ask to see a rental list, really to try to build rapport and try to kind of talk to property managers so that they would have a more positive understanding of them, which is a way that people try to get around that stigma. And they would just be told right off the bat, no, sorry, we don't have a list. There's no list here for you. And later they would find out there'd been a list all along. It just hadn't been given to them, presumably because they looked visibly homeless. And they describe this as a wall that's hard to break through, a wall that just comes up again and again that stops people from getting into housing and keeps people in that system of inequality that keeps people homeless, that keeps people out of housing with their animals. One of the big issues with this is pet relinquishment, which I'm sure we've all heard about, that often if you are trying to get into housing, one of the things that people are faced with is the decision of whether or not to relinquish their animal, which is a devastating choice for the humans who have to make that, but it's also really catastrophic for the animals and can have deadly consequences. If they're relinquished and they are euthanized, they're relinquished and they're put in an unsafe housing situation, it's really difficult for humans and animals to navigate this. And there's a lot of pressure on some people to navigate this kind of relationship. So one person I spoke to had been couch surfing with their mum for a while, and they'd been rejected for about a year and a half. They'd applied for so many houses, house after house after house. And after a year and a half, their mum was starting to get at them about getting rid of these animals that were presumably stopping them from getting into housing. And you see this attitude come out about, well, if you're not accepting housing, if you're not getting housing after a year and a half, there's an element of blame that you're choosing to be homeless. You know, you probably could have a house if you would just be willing to get rid of your animals. It's seen as you're not choosing to be housed with your children because you're putting the privilege of your dog over your children. And this was particularly challenging for multi-species families that included children, because when faced with the prospect of homelessness, there's additional complications for the choice to not accept a house that's offered to you when you have children. You can't really choose to be homeless when you have children, even if you're offered something that's not pet friendly. So this relinquishment push comes up again and again. And I spoke to a couple who were living with quite a few animals, and they had been insecure housing for a really long time. They had 12-month leases if they were lucky enough to get them. And in between that, they were couch surfing, they were staying in shacks if they could find them. And they were moving literally anywhere in the state that they could find housing and shaping their whole lives just around trying to find a property that they could live in with their animal companions and their children. And the last house that they were in, this is a house that they were in when I spoke to them, this was the time when they really thought they just weren't going to get somewhere. They were staying in a shack. They couldn't stay in the shack forever. It was really small. It was dilapidated. They were there with their kids. They were there with their animals, and they just reached the end of the road. They'd been rejected over and over again. And eventually they started to write up ads to give away their pets. And when they told me this story, they were crying. I'm going to try not to cry as I tell you this story. And they were just talking about the process of having to look at their animals and write up an ad to try to give them away and try to find them a home. And think about what that would mean for their kids, for their family, for the animals. And it was really heartbreaking seeing them. It was, yeah, the man especially was crying. Then crying always makes me cry a little bit. And just seeing how they'd grappled with this choice, that they'd really reached the end of the road. They'd tried everything they could. They were essentially squatting in a shack. And this was the only option that they had left. They didn't have a small enough family that they could live in a car. They probably would have if they could have. And just at the last minute, they managed to get a house. But seeing that heartbreak as they tried to navigate that was really, really awful. And this is something that a lot of people are facing at the moment. And similarly, another client that I spoke to who had come through homelessness had just found that they had used those kind of pet boarding programs you can access through places like the RSPCA, but they have time limits on them. And they'd essentially put their animal into a pet boarding program so that the human family could live homeless, but the pets would be in boarding. They'd moved into crisis accommodation and they were just there too long, and the animal had then been adopted out. So again, that family was broken up, and that was really heartbreaking for them to navigate. So I was like, okay, so you're in housing now. What's it like to actually manage pet-friendly rental accommodation when you get there? What is it like to manage this accommodation once you're actually in a house and you feel like you've got usually a 12-month lease? How do you try to hold on to that? What's it like to live in that situation? And again, this idea of insecurity just permeated everything about this process of living in a house. So people talked about this idea of constant insecurity, being very aware that at most you were on a 12-month lease if you were lucky. And that lease often was written in a way that made you really feel the insecurity of your situation. So one client spoke to me, they had 3 dogs, they had 2 cats, they had a turtle, they had a lot of animals. They'd previously had a lot of trouble in rental accommodation of these animals being used as sort of a bargaining chip to say, well, you can't really do anything about it if we treat you unfairly, if we do anything like this, because no one will ever house you again. So they'd come into this house knowing that they were really precarious, and if they didn't manage to hold on to this house, the consequence was probably homelessness. And for them, this meant that they firstly lived under constant hypervigilance, constant stress, trying to keep their family quiet, trying to keep them under control, trying to make sure no one had any signs of living in the house. But they'd also had to sign this lease that a lot of people told me about that essentially said that your animals had to live outside. And in their spoken negotiations with people, they'd said, so the animals can be inside and outside, and they'd said that that was fine. But when they came to sign this lease, the document that they had to sign said that the animals were outside. And they were constantly aware that this meant that they were essentially living in breach of their lease. They were trying to hold on to housing. They were trying to do the right thing, but they had been put in a situation where they had to live in breach of their lease, which meant that the rug could be pulled out from under them all of the time. Some families said they didn't even bother getting rid of boxes because moving was just expensive, and they knew they'd probably have to move again every 12 months. So just trying to keep the costs down, the burden down of having to pack up your life again and again. And other people, like the quote that I've got there, would move into a house, they would say it's pet friendly, and when they got there, they'd be like, all right, you can live here, but if I decide you can't live here with the animals, you're going to have to get rid of them. And that's a very conditional way to get people into housing, which means that they're constantly living with that fickle future, that insecurity, where you never are really completely housed, you're never really safe, you can't relax. The consequence of this is that a lot of people live in unsafe or undesirable housing. So people speak to me about having unwanted sexual advances from their property managers. The person I've quoted there had gaping holes and insecure floorboards in their house so that the floor would give way. And if they ever tried to complain about it, they would always think about the fact that to get another house, they needed a good reference from their current land manager. And if their property manager or their landlord said that they were troublemakers, they wouldn't get another house. So she fell through the floor, broke her ankle, her partner fell through the floor, injured themselves. There was a hole in the roof, there was a big crack in there, and they wouldn't complain about anything because they knew what the consequences likely were. They just had to live like that and put up because they had animals and they weren't necessarily safe in their housing. This was also an issue, as I mentioned, with housing management overstepping. So this could be that your landlord lets themselves into your house all of the time. It could mean that property managers don't necessarily follow the rules of what they're supposed to do. So some people had property managers going through their wardrobes and their cupboards, commenting on other aspects of their personal lives, making really inappropriate, untoward advances and things like that. And again, they would resist retaliating because they knew what the consequences were. The person in the quote here didn't actually live with 3 cats and a dog, but they, as soon as they questioned whether their landlord could come into their property without giving any notice, so they couldn't just let themselves in, they got that email that just said, you've got too many animals, you've got to get out. And they had to try to fight that then through the tenancy board, through official channels to essentially get that black mark taken off their name, and also try to hold on to their housing to say, well, I've only got 1 cat, and essentially you've just made this up because I've pissed you off. So again, trying to navigate that really insecure situation where you're vulnerable and you can be kicked out at any time. I feel like have I overstayed my welcome yet? Can someone message me if I've run out of time? But really what this came down to is that tenant behavior was always under stress. There was a constant stress, there was constant insecurity. This has mental health consequences for people. It means that you can never relax in your housing, you can never feel at home, and you never feel like you can live in your house. For companion animals, this had a really big impact on actually being able to live in the house. So not being able to move freely through the house, not being able to use inside-outside spaces, having behavior a lot more heavily controlled if you're worried about animals scratching the floor or scratching a door or doing anything that might leave any mark on the house that made it look lived in, meant that companion animals had less agency and less freedom, and essentially restricted the relationships they could have in there, which again has really sad consequences for multi-species families for whom these links are kind of a source of joy. They're a source of security. They're a source of ontological security. And all of these things are really important and are impacted by this housing insecurity. All right. So it feels like it goes without saying that keeping multi-species families together is really important. Multi-species families are just specifically and incredibly vulnerable in the context of housing insecurity. And what I mean by specifically is just that, multi-species families have particular impacts, which is that you can be euthanized, you can be killed. There are different consequences that are faced by animals in non-human families that aren't faced by people in single species families. And you can see there quotes from people who are talking about the impacts of what it would be like to have to give up their animals in this particular situation. I'm going to skip to the last slide because I think I might be over time, but my messages are broken. And lastly, when I spoke to people about suggested improvements, they came up with a few different things that they would like to change about the housing system. But the one thing I want to draw your attention to is changing structural issues, changing attitudes towards animals, towards renters, towards particular demographics, and really working towards increasing the housing supply. And I think for activists, this is somewhere that is really important to focus our efforts on. And I know after this, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that you can do, some of the future actions so that we can start working on challenging these structural issues rather than just band-aiding kind of individual changes that help individual people get housing. So I'm sorry, that was very quick, but I hope I gave you a little bit of an overview into what some of that research was about. And I'm happy to talk more about it if you like, but I suspect that was a lot.
Wonderful. Thanks, Zoe. That was very good. I'd like to now introduce Nita Alexander. Nita is a PhD candidate in sociology at James Cook University and is a co-convener of the TASA Activism Thematic Group. Nita's going to talk to us a little bit about the launch of the Fickle Futures blog and about the project. Welcome, Nita. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, John. That's great. And I would like to first of all thank you to Dr. Lawless and Dr. Zoei Sutton. Those presentations were absolutely fantastic and I thoroughly enjoyed, and I'm also grateful that you shared these things. I think it's really important. So thank you both for your time and effort here today. That's really, really wonderful. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal land in Borlu, also known as Perth, and I would like to acknowledge that these lands are unceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I'll just share a quick screen with you here. Hopefully you can see that okay. So it is with great pleasure and also great pride, and also congratulations to the team, that I would like to announce the launch of our blog titled Fickle Futures, the New Homelessness. So as this webinar itself is a collaboration between the TASA thematic groups, the blog is a continuation of that collaboration. So the blog will be run by John and myself from the TASA Activism thematic group, Dr. Lawless from the Stratification thematic group, and Dr. Zoei Sutton, Dr. Josephine, Browne, and Alex Hill from the TASA Animals group. So thank you everyone for coming on board for this project. It's really wonderful to be able to finally be launching. Our first blog will be published next week, and we're very excited to let you all know when that's finally live and up on the website. But I want to just let you know, first of all, a bit about the blog, like why are we actually doing this? So each blog has a specific purpose. We don't want it to simply be I guess what you could say is like a bit of a talk fest where we just talk about how bad this is. We want to very much be focused from an action perspective. What can we do? What can we do as sociologists? And also what can we do as individuals? So the blogs are going to have a specific focus, first of all, to share information, just to talk about the issue and to say whatever the theme is for that month, to say what the key factors are in relation to that. We'll then also offer a brief sociological analysis in relation to that issue. But most of all, we would like to end each blog with a call for action to anybody who is following along and supporting us on this project. Now, call for action doesn't need to be a massive thing, okay? Everyone's got different commitments, different time available, and also different finances. It can be very small micro actions we do, such as buying a pay it forward coffee, through to something more substantial as volunteering your time at an organisation, or perhaps for a long-term project to join a campaign in order to change policy relating to these things. So there really is a wide range of action that can be done, but we're hoping to, with each blog, just bring out some of these ideas, and maybe one or two of them will resonate with you and you might like to be able to take one of those on board. There will be monthly themes for the blog, and just a couple of examples of those will be the unique experience of Christmas and the silly season, the fun season for everyone while you're homeless. How do you navigate that time of year? We're also going to have a focus on specific homelessness crises in relation to environmental events, in particular with the Northern Rivers crisis. And also we like to focus on lived experience as well. But these monthly themes will be varied and they will change every month. And there may only be one blog a month or multiple. We're keeping it quite flexible. Each blog will also have a Did You Know section. And the purpose of that is that we'd actually really like to have people following this blog and supporting this blog who may actually need help themselves. And sometimes when you're in that moment of crisis, you can't always think straight and find the information you need to perhaps make those decisions or find the help that's out there, because everything can be so overwhelming. So we're hoping to just incorporate a little bit of just a few tips and did you know factors that may actually help people out on the ground who are facing these issues. And then as I said previously, the main thing is what can we actually do as sociologists, as academics, but also just as individuals in our community. We are open to ideas for the blog as well. And when I'm finished chatting here now, I'm going to pop some email addresses and Twitter handles into the chat. Please take those down and follow us so that you can get in touch with us if you have any ideas, if you want to contribute to the blog, or you just have an idea for a theme, or even an idea for an action that you might be doing and you want some people to help or support you. We'd be happy to share and promote that as well. I'll also be uploading a link where you can subscribe to the blog. In case you're not on social media, we can still email the blog to you as well. So please do subscribe, and I'll pop those in the chat in just a moment. Thanks very much, John.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nita. So we do have a little bit of time now so that we can have a little bit of a discussion if there's any questions for our speakers today or any commentary. So we probably have about 6 or 7 minutes. So look, we're quite a comfy group here. So feel free to either use the virtual hand if you want to pop that up to ask a question, or you can probably just come off mute, or if you're more comfortable putting the question in the chat, that's fine as well. So I can see already Josephine's got a question for Zoe. Josephine.
Hi, thanks, John. Thanks so much for the presentations, and I do know I'm part of the Fickle Futures group, but I just wondered, Zoe, I was really captured by this organisation you mentioned in South Australia, Safe Families, Safe Pets. I just wondered, is that a national group, or do you know if they're elsewhere in the country or even around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I go on, I do want to mention I'm joining you from beautiful Ghana land, which got lost in my hubbub with the computer drama. But yeah, Safe Pets, Safe Families they started as a South Australian organisation and they've gone national now. So you should be able to find them online, which I think is safepetsafefamilies.org. There's a bunch of ways that you can get involved and support them if you like. If you're somewhere where they're currently operating, they always need foster carers. If you have room in your house that you could take in an animal for a couple of days or a couple of weeks or a couple of months. But they also look for volunteers for a whole range of things. If you can't donate your space in your home, you can donate money, you can donate time, or you can just amplify what they're doing by sharing their posts. So safepetsafefamilies.org is a good place to go. Thank you for asking, Josephine.
Is there any other questions? Thanks, Ali. Is there any comments maybe that people would like to make? And Zoe and Nita, is there anything you'd like to maybe add that you mentioned?
Can I just jump in and say thank you? Beautiful and moving presentations, and I think it's always entirely appropriate, as I've put in the chat, that we bring these emotions into the public domain. They are part of research, part of experience, and part of research impact and impacting others. So yeah, just thank you, and it's yeah, really great to see also the growth in interest in nurturing the relationships of people who are experiencing homelessness, whether that's with other humans or non-humans, and not seeing responses to people experiencing homelessness as simply this kind of individualistic one, trying to, like, I love that idea of trying to keep people within communities, whether they were involved animals and humans or one or the other. I guess a good response to people experiencing homelessness is to hold that community together, because long term that is what will support and increase opportunities for people to thrive. And yeah, so that's such an important angle, and you don't often hear it. We often kind of get quite a medicalised or individualistic response to people experiencing homelessness. So I love that kind of broadened vision. So thank you, Anne. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you, Catherine. Zoe.
I just had a question for Anne, if you don't mind. Because I love birds, I'm really interested in what it's like to navigate these spaces with a bird specifically. Like when you take Bernie around and you take him to these different places, are there different things that you do with him to kind of, I don't know, be in a space with a bird in different locations and move around?
Yeah, I do have to. I've developed a skill now in moving with birds. When we first started moving together in 2014, I was told it just wouldn't be possible and that I was cruel to do it. But I thought there was another cruelty, which is not staying together. And so I think this audience will understand it. I made him a very solemn promise: we will stay together no matter what. I have the privilege of being able of having a savings account. Not all people do. And so I've been drawing from my savings account to move with him. He flies because it's less stressful. Birds do stress very easily. And although he is remarkable, he's my teacher. He teaches me about stress. During the whole presentation, he's been singing and whistling. And we have for each other, and that's part of answering your question, we have a comfort click, which is a little comforting noise that when I first rescued him, because he is a rescue and he's very badly developed in his chest, he wasn't fed properly as a baby. His chest is quite underdeveloped, but we have a comfort click. What I've seen since he came here was that he's been doing that to me during this presentation. So one of the things we do is, because I've got the privilege of being able to draw on savings, I move him by air and we go from state to state. This year, 4 by the end of the year, and he travels with a company called Dog Tainers. And they do everything for me. They pick him up at the front door and they put him on the plane. They get him off the plane. They can give him rest breaks in between long plane flights, and they will do that at the end of the month. And they did it on the way here. And then they look after him until I can get him. So they will put him into boarding for me. They take care of everything. He has to have a particular sort of carrier, which is called a PP2, and it's got a perch inside it. And it must have, I'm required and they're required to provide him with water. So there's like a little water thing just outside that feeds into his carrier. I could not do it without the help of a professional pet transport company. I don't have a car, I don't have a driver's license. I've got a fairly serious mobility disability. So I manage it by using my privilege to be able to do that. In general, people don't object as much to landlords in the past have not objected to either a bird or a fish. When I did first get him, I rescued him. I had to move quickly because I knew he was dying. It was within hours, if I didn't get days and hours, that if I didn't get to him, he was going to die. When I first rescued him 17 and a bit years ago, we had to manage all of that and navigate all of that. But the comfort click has been a multi-species thing because he does it back. And the first time I heard it, I was using it with him for thunderstorms and lawnmowers, and he now can handle thunderstorms and lawnmowers. When he first got here, he didn't like, thank you, Joe, thank you so much for coming. When he first came here, he didn't like the sound. We're living near fire engine place, firehouse, he would scream at the sound of fire engines. So now he just, oh, okay, fire engine.
Thank you. I love hearing the comfort click. That's beautiful. I've never heard of that before.
We can go a little bit over time, so just a sort of last call if there's any final comments or questions. Anne and Zoe, if there's anything you'd like to end on before we end. Yeah, Anne.
This in another presentation which I did last week for the TASA symposium, which was a small event held last week. I talked about the role for older women in this crisis and presented some data and some readings on older women and homelessness. One of the things that I only referred to it very briefly, but one of the things about navigating my own homelessness has been the social capital I'm able to draw from, the privilege that I have that I can manage it in this way. And also, I suppose, not only that older women do seem to be delaying their presentation to crisis services because they mobilise that social capital. And I've got the research, I presented it last week, and they really want to keep their pets with them. They really, really want the animals. They see them as a source of strength and mutual comfort, just as some of you have noticed. I've seen some words in the chat about that, about the significance of a species adopting behaviour to respond to my distress and discomfort. And sometimes in the middle of the night, 3 a.m. is pretty scary when you're homeless. In drawing on that social capital, I have had some privilege, and my position on privilege was the last thought I'll leave you with is if I've got privilege, I don't just need to acknowledge it, I need to use it to the benefit of others, and hence the Fickle Futures project. And also, perhaps my last statement, I will slip one more in, is, as Zoe noted, it's not just a fickle future for humans, it's a fickle future for our animal companions. This is a really tough time, and we're hoping that the project will help us address that in a small way, that we're going to make our contribution. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Any last comments? Otherwise, I will start to wind us up. No. So
sorry, John. Maria's got her hand up.
Oh, sorry, Maria, please.
I just wanted to say thank you to both of the presentations. Are absolutely wonderful, absolutely amazing, and just
thank you, Maria.
Heartfelt and real. And wonderful data. If anyone was doing a thesis on homelessness, which I think is really relevant and topical, but it is, you very rarely get data like that if you want to speak in sociological terms. It's just wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. I've got several friends going through homelessness at the moment, and I knew they were brave, but I just didn't realise how brave. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. And that's all I've got to say. Yeah.
Thank you, Maria. I think, look, let's end on that. I think that's a nice way of finishing up. I think we really want to encourage you to engage with the project and with the blog and what Nita presented, and we are hoping obviously to help understand homelessness a lot more, but also really trying to find those actions, both those macro and those micro actions as well, and really sort of look to make difference. So look, I'd like to say, thank you obviously to Anne and Zoe and Nita for their presentations today, and also thank all of you for joining us and helping to make the webinar a success.